It's Budget Insider 2020. Those of you who know Innovation Oz know that every year on budget night we have an budget innovation soiree where James and Denham go down to lock up in Canberra. Today they're with us remotely. Denham is in lockdown in Melbourne and James is with us from Sydney, where we're going to discuss the announcement from yesterday now that we've had a little bit of time to talk through it. My name is Corrie McLeod. I'm the publisher of InnovationAus.com and the CEO of Hello Espresso. We'll be joined in just a few minutes with some panelists that are going to help us talk through the details of the budget and answer any questions that you have. But right now, I would like to introduce James Riley, the editorial director of Innovation Oz, who's going to give us a 3-minute summary of his impressions of this year's budget from an innovation perspective. James?
Thanks, Corey. Look, I'm going to be very quick because I'm going to be reporting this event. So I'm interested to hear what Matt Crozier, Roy Green and Catherine Ball have to add. Look, generally on this budget, obviously it's a budget delivered at a very strange time. It's a strange time of year, and obviously the crisis is on us. It's hard to complain about the level of, it's hard to complain about government spending in a budget that sets records on spending, and it's hard to complain about not enough money being put into your sort of pet areas when record deficits are being set. But having said that, my overall impression from, and you know, I'll preface this just by saying I view the world through a straw, like many people, and my particular straw is on the tech and innovation sectors. But I think it's broadly a missed opportunity, and we'll have to wait till next May to see whether this budget was just setting out some feelers to a more substantial effort further down the track in the next budget in May. I think some of the pre-budget announcements were interesting and smart and well-intentioned, and will have good impact in manufacturing and the digitization of the economy. I mean, I'm sure this will be a discussion, but obviously they're horizontal sectors, and any capability and capacity that we can build in those areas has you know, a tremendous flow-on effect to other vertical industries across the sector. The NBN announcement, obviously, it feels like that was knocking barnacles off. That was something that had to be done eventually, and now is a very good time to do it. I simply think some of the spending measures might have been missing a zero. When we look at things like the $450 million to the CSIRO, that's largely replacement money for industry money that would have been coming in had the pandemic not hit. So I guess it's, you know, it's a smart investment insofar as the CSIRO won't have to start sacking researchers, and you know, we maintain our capability. Similarly, the $1 billion to university research is really a lifeline. It's not an extension of research capability, and certainly not a strategic investment in specific priority research areas. I think it's great that the government has got over its allergies to picking winners. I just wish they would go harder and deeper on that. Just finally, I would say there's a couple of areas of low-hanging fruit that the government didn't address, and I really wish they would. They've had a couple of goes at reforming government procurement as a means of driving industry development. This is something that seems a no-brainer to me. Other countries do it. In the area of information technology, it would be a tremendous boost if we could even put 10% or increase by 10% the amount of the, you know, $9 or $10 billion annually spent on information technology towards local IT companies, giving them prime contracts in strategic areas to build capacity and capability. I mean, that as a single funding lever would have tremendous impact. I would have liked to have seen some more on just talent, attraction of talent. I was very interested recently, John Martinez, the ex-Google quantum engineer who has come to Australia to join Michelle Simmons' efforts at Silicon Quantum Computing, the startup she runs. I mean, we have the ability to attract tremendous talent. I'm not talking about bringing in, plane loads of standard IT workers. I'm talking these tremendously talented individuals. I think in not even a post-pandemic world, in our current world, we should be marketing our beaches, we should be marketing our successful multicultural society, we should be marketing our successful, response to COVID as a means to attracting some, serious global firepower to our industry. With that, I am looking forward to this discussion, and I'm going to step back, go on mute, and start my recorder, and I'll be very interested to hear what people have got to say.
Thank you, James. I'd like to now introduce Denham Sadler, who will be familiar to many of our readers as a senior reporter for InnovationAus.com. Denham, you and I had a chat earlier about how we would break down some of the key announcements for the tech and innovation sector. And as it turns out, as James mentioned as well, a lot of those announcements actually happened pre-budget. Would you mind just talking us through those 3 or 4 things that happened in the lead up to the budget that are particularly important for our sector?
Yeah, definitely. So as James kind of mentioned at the start, kind of probably the biggest ticket items for us were kind of announced some of them months ago, some of them in the last week, always kind of pre-announced. So there are no big surprises for us. And that was the cybersecurity strategy. So that's about $1.7 billion across a whole range of things. And a lot of that's reappropriated defense funding, but it's still kind of new funding for cybersecurity. And then we had the big digital package, which was kind of digitizing the economy, which was 800 million. And the bulk of that's going towards about half of that to modernizing the business registers. So they're kind of combining that into one big platform. And then another big chunk, about 250 million, was going towards the DTA's digital identity scheme, which that's more funding than it's had in its whole life. So that was a pretty big funding announcement. And then we had the NBN announcement, obviously, which James covered a bit. And then the manufacturing strategy from last week is obviously really huge for our space, and that's the area that James was talking about where they're really picking winners. They've picked 6 kind of key sectors that they're going to focus pretty much all that funding on. So that was a really big one where they've shifted the strategy a bit and gone with, we're going to pick a few winners, a few areas of national importance, and we're going to kind of really zero in on those to direct $1.5 billion in funding.
One of the areas that's been really, I guess, keenly anticipated is the R&D tax initiative. There was some updates to that. Can you just talk us through what was the contentious point and where have we landed with the budget? Yeah,
well, this is probably the biggest one on the actual night, the biggest surprise. We had a bit of a hint last week that it might be happening, but yeah, had it all confirmed. And it's kind of a funny situation. The biggest thing is kind of the announcement that they're not doing something, but these were kind of planned cuts to the scheme through a number of changes that have been in the works for about 2.5 years now that would have amounted to, it was a $1.8 billion cut to the scheme, and it was through quite a number of changes. And there's been a lot of outcry, a lot of criticism about that will kind of make Australia not as competitive as overseas countries to conduct R&D, and kind of through a number of inquiries and submissions, we heard that companies were considering moving operations overseas or kind of relocating entirely because of these changes. And there's been a big campaign to get them dropped well before COVID to do that, but it seems like it's taken the pandemic to convince the government that, because in the budget, they've completely scrapped pretty much all the controversial elements of those reforms. They're kind of calling it enhancements, and they're calling it a $2 billion investment when 1.8 billion of that is just from not making some cuts. So there's about 240 million extra money is going to go through the scheme, but basically, they've increased the offset for smaller companies. If you've got 220 million in turnover or less, you're probably going to get a better return. And they were planning to make a $4 million cap on the offset for those sort of companies, and they've got rid of that plan. And then for bigger companies, they were planning to introduce this pretty complicated intensity measure that was widely criticized, and they've changed that a bit into a 2-tiered system that's much more simple, and so far seems to have pretty good reactions from the industry. That's going to make things a bit simpler and probably still get a pretty good return. And they're keeping plans they're lifting the expenditure threshold up to 150 million. They're sticking to that. So yeah, basically they're getting rid of pretty much all the elements that were widely criticized from the original plans. And they've already introduced legislation to Parliament, which is going to kick in from July next year. So there's no concerns about retrospectively applying any of these changes anymore, which was another big one.
Okay, so moving to some of the announcements with regards to funding for both, higher education research translation fund, and there was also a CSIRO announcement in the budget. Can you just talk us through the different announcements? We'll look forward to deconstructing that a little bit more in the panel, but at a high level, what were those two big pieces?
Yeah, so as James kind of pointed out, this is kind of just shoring up these sectors that have kind of been really hit hard by the pandemic and the loss of kind of commercial funding through CSIRO and the universities. So CSIRO is getting an extra 459 million, and that's over 4 years. And that is really kind of plugging up what they're going to lose from commercial funding and other activities. It's kind of plugging a hole to make sure they keep going with their research. And in terms of the university research, they're getting $1 billion, and that's a similar sort of situation of making sure they can keep going with existing research and new stuff in the wake of obviously what's happening with the university sectors at the moment are getting obviously really hard hit by the pandemic. And a really interesting part of that as well is quite a lot of funding towards kind of scoping out different areas to look at ways to kind of address the translation of research and commercialization, which is something that Australia's always ranks very lowly in terms of. We always struggle with that, and that an obvious answer to that could potentially be kind of a translational fund, and that's something that a lot of people are calling for. A lot of universities were hoping we'd see that in the budget last night, but now there's hopes that this study is going to end up in that hopefully by the May budget. That could be a real possibility.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier the digital ID, Centrelink, just some announcements there as well?
Yes, as always, quite a lot of funding to kind of internal digital transformation projects. So there was about $250 million to digital ID that was announced a few weeks ago. And then there was another pretty huge, about $540 million to the Centrelink payments overhaul, which is it's been ongoing for about 7 years now to kind of completely overhaul this 30-year-old system, I think. So that's for the last stage of the tranche to overhaul. It's called the WPIT. And then the DTA has also received about $20 million for MyGov, and some of that is going towards kind of running it as is. And they're also an ongoing project to update it and this new platform that kind of spinning as a social media inspired version of it. And that's extra funding going towards that as well.
I'll take myself off mute. Thank you, Denham. That is a very useful overview. And if I can ask you to hang around, while I introduce our panel, we have been very lucky to have three incredible industry, personalities, if you like, and people with their own deep expertise that I'm really delighted to introduce. The first, Professor Roy Green, who in the time that InnovationAus has been publishing has been a constant and much regarded or well regarded voice in the innovation sector. Roy Green is Emeritus Professor and Chair of the Innovation Council at University of Technology, Sydney. He's chaired the Australian Government's Innovative Regions Centre at the CSIRO, the Manufacturing Sector Advisory Council. He currently chairs the Port of Newcastle and Advanced Robotics Manufacturing Hub, and is a board member of the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre. Professor Green, your entire bio is on our Eventbrite. Otherwise, I'm going to get tongue twisted with all of the different roles that you have, but delighted to welcome you to the panel tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Catherine Ball works globally across a range of projects, from creating documentaries to leading conferences and events to advising on the use of novel approaches, particularly with drones across environmental and humanitarian projects. Catherine has a degree in environmental protection and a PhD in spatial ecology, descriptive and predictive statistics at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. You've got a passion for community engagement with STEM and demystifying emerging tech. And you continue to support Australia as being a world leader in the advancement of ethically driven technology applications. So thank you so much for joining us, Catherine.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
Also, I'd like to introduce our final panelist. Matt Crozier is the CEO and co-founder of Bang the Table. I first met Matt about 16 years ago, I think, when it was a very small company. I'd like to reintroduce Matt as the founder of a very large company that has grown substantially to about 700 clients and 100 people in what is now a global business. Matt's recently returned from, I think, 4 years in Boulder, Colorado, and we're delighted to welcome Matt to the panel just to bring, I guess, a fresh lens on someone who has a lot of experience in growing a global business with Australian technology. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Corrie. Hi, everyone.
So with our panelists, I think the best way to start, I might ask you at a high level, what did you see in the budget that you thought was great and what was missing? And I might start, Roy Green, I might start with you if I could.
Yeah, well, thanks, Corrie, and very pleased to be on this event. I guess we did get some good news, which was to stem the fall in our R&D expenditure as a country and as a share of GDP. As we know, it's one of the lowest now in the OECD, around 1.79%, down from 2.2% a few years ago, and 2.4% for the OECD as a whole, and many other countries at 3% plus. So we did see the surprise announcements to provide $1 billion to the university sector, and that helps offset the huge losses from the collapse of international student revenues. And we also saw the reversal of the potential reductions to the R&D tax incentive, and with some tweaking of the criteria as well, as Denham has pointed out, which is very favourable, I think, to those who are applying for the R&D tax incentive. And we saw several other measures which are going to have an impact as well. The provision of some additional resources to the CSIRO, and what was announced last week by the Prime Minister, the $1.5 billion manufacturing initiative. That's over 4 years, mind you, so around $370 million a year. Now, these are significant. They're not to be sneezed at, but then again, other countries are not only taking these initiatives as well, but doing them on a much bigger scale. Germany around $80 billion, Britain with its R&D roadmap around 40 billion, even little Singapore around 20 billion. Joe Biden's promised around 400 billion, and that doesn't even count the broader rescue package that he has in mind for that country. So we have to think of it as a holding operation at this stage, and it fits into the government's logic, because the first stage of the government's response to COVID was to really introduce job protection, job and income protection, which was absolutely essential, and they did that on a very large scale, which was commendable. This round is about job creation, job maker measures, especially focusing on infrastructure, and the very large, the big picture in this is the investment allowance, $27 billion. And we look forward, as was indicated earlier, to stage 3, which is the structural reform component. And if these measures that are taken at the moment are welcome, what would be even more welcome, I think, in the future is a broader framework, a national industrial strategy in which all of these elements are joined up in a much more effective and coherent way, so that we can reposition Australia's economy, use this crisis as an opportunity to reposition Australia's economy, which we haven't yet done following the mining boom, and that is to a more complex economy, a more research-intensive economy, and one which is based on knowledge and ingenuity, where our competitive advantage includes design, it includes quality, it includes innovation, rather than simply relying on export of unprocessed natural resources. And so there's a lot of opportunity there, with especially with the manufacturing package, with the 6 areas that have been identified. This is not just to plug gaps in global supply chains, but in local supply chains, but also to pursue global opportunities. And we can certainly take advantage of these over the next few months, but the real game in town possibly is coming up at the May budget next year.
Thank you. Professor Roy Green, I'd like to circle back to some of those themes that you brought up later in the panel, because there is a lot of, if you like, picking winners or trying to paint the picture of what the economic opportunity is going forward. And I guess there is an important sort of gap between now and May that there'll be some lessons learned, I'd expect. Dr. Catherine Ball, can I ask you, what was it that jumped out at you as being fantastic in the budget, and was there any glaring holes? And you did mention earlier you were getting feedback from people that you put a call out to your networks. What's the feedback?
Well, the feedback is pretty much already what's been said. This is an oxygen mask to keep us going. If we think about it, 2020, we're still in the middle of the war right now. 2021 will be our entry into peacetime. 2021 will be our year of reckoning. By the time we hit April, May 2021, that's when we'll start seeing where the damage actually has really been done across our small business sector, our startup sector, and our university sector. We're all holding on across those sectors, I think, are holding our breath to a certain extent, but you can only hold your breath so long before you start drowning. So some of the things I was really grateful to see was that there was no change to the R&D tax incentive. And the reason why is I have a personal story around that, where we started doing the long range drone reconnaissance work, looking at marine mammals and turtle surveys in Western Australia. And the only reason my corporate entity that I was hired by at the time was able to do that work was because we were able to utilize the R&D tax incentives that were there for us. Otherwise we never would have. I think people need to remember that large corporations can be just as innovative as startups and small businesses. They can ring fence, they can back things, they can bring big parties to the table. And so there's an actual iterative aspect to this that I was quite glad to see, that the universities are being shored up. CSIRO has been given a bit of oxygen. But that means that some of the cuts that we were going to start seeing hopefully maybe put on pause. I only wish that we'd been told some of this stuff sooner, because a lot of those cuts have already started happening and the reorgs have already started happening. During a time of record deficit, one of the things we really need to see is a record return on investment. So you need to make sure that you put the money where you're going to get more money back. Glaring omissions, and I hate to be the woman that raises this, but childcare is not mentioned. A reform of childcare is not mentioned at all. And I think everybody in the world that has been through a lockdown due to coronavirus recognises the value of schools and childcare in order for us to get on with our work lives. One of the statistics that really shocked me today was a graph that showed that unemployment rates in Australia in 2020, 2021, where basically the majority of women over the age of 40 are going to be starting to hit trouble. And we need to look at how we shore up some of the women who would like to go back to work, but unfortunately will not be going back. And I think the underemployed, the face of the underemployed and the face of the unemployed in Australia will be a woman over the age of 40. That kind of pressure really will start to undo all of the good work that this government and governments beforehand have done to shore up the pathways for women into STEM. All of us around here know, we've read the McKinsey studies, we've read the Harvard Business School studies that prove that if you have diversity around a board table, you have a more profitable entity. Why haven't we looked at some of the levers around profitability and return on investment with regard to things like diversity, and some of the levers we need to shore up that women still have a place around the board table and a place at work? Really happy to see that they extended Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith's role as the Women in STEM ambassador. I feel that if we look at universities in the way we are going to be able to take advantage of things like the translational research funds that will hopefully be coming online, is that we need to have a diversity and a strength of diversity around the table. I have to be the woman that flags it. Childcare really was the resounding echo that I had from both my male and female friends. The idea as well is that universities are already looking at a lot of this. This is not an idea that's just come out of federal government. I know a number of universities that are already looking at micro-credentialing. Basically, universities never want us to graduate from our alma maters. They want to have us constantly coming back to top up our knowledge and our resources. I'd like to see a shift away from non-accredited training that people spend a lot of money on, and actually choosing our universities to do their accredited training so that they can actually put something back into our universities at the same time. No offense to those that deliver non-accredited training, I might be biased. I'd like our universities to see some of that money, and I'd like to have seen some support, and there is some support around that, so I was grateful to see that. With regard to things like some of the translational research and the corporate relationships, we've got the new ANU bushfire initiative that's just kicked off, for example. So some of those hideous problems that we've had even before the pandemic hit, we already had floods, fires, cyclones, climate change related and climate mitigation related science and technology seems to have been slightly omitted from this, though I'm wondering what that 1 billion for universities is actually going to look like. Medical research is incredibly important, but I do have to flag that there are other areas that are also very important when it comes to research as well as pure medical research. And the glaring error for me was the arts. And I say that from a scientist's perspective, because unless someone watches a movie or a documentary or reads a book or a magazine or watches something where they care about the science and how it's being developed and how it's being applied, or they know enough to be able to argue or interrogate that science, communication in the arts is equally important as grassroots research. When we all got locked down, the first things we turned to were the arts, the books, the music, the movies, the television programs. And so I feel like the arts have not been valued for the mental health support that they actually have been during 2020.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning the arts. As publishers and journalists, we appreciate that because, I do think it's an important point when we're talking about innovation and STEM, etc., that we live in a broad world. So just before we go to Matt Crozier, I just want to say, feel free to load us up with questions. We'll keep an eye on the chat box when we can circle back after Matt Crozier. Your observations from the panel. I mean, not from the panel, sorry, from the budget. What did you see that you liked? And the panel, if you like. And what did you see that was missing? And is it hard coming back and landing in Australia, coming out of quarantine and looking at the budget from completely fresh eyes, I guess?
Well, I wouldn't call it hard. It's actually really nice to get back to Australia and get to somewhere where there's some sane governance going on. And I think if I'm going to summarize the budget, I mean, I sign up to just about everything I've heard from the other panelists. I think, there's a lot there that I hadn't thought of that really stands out. But I'd suggest, I don't want to comment on whether it's a good or bad budget. It was probably a very good one. Australia needs a lot for a lot of sectors, but the narrow lens through which I view the world, thinking about the tech sector, there was a lot not there that I hope might get a look in May next time around. There are some real problems that need to be addressed. A lot of us have done fine through this crisis. But there are a lot who've done less well. And the first thing I think that needs to be addressed is, we've got a lot of companies out there who are kind of late stage startups or later stage startups who've maybe taken on private equity investment and they operate to a runway. They're going to run out of money at some point in the future. And they're high growth businesses. So a lot of the government support that comes out for businesses hasn't applied to them because they're still growing, just growing at a lesser rate. Now, straight away, they're at risk of a kind of devaluation because their growth rates are dropping off. But frankly, they're also suffering a real pinch point in capital for their next raise because the government, at the same time as it's been helping businesses through the pandemic, has, through the Foreign Exchange Review Board, basically choked off the flow of international capital into our markets. It takes up to 6 months to get approval for a foreign investment with a threshold of 0 at the moment. And I was hoping in the budget we might see something to address this, something to help businesses to expand that runway so that those businesses that will be the big employers in 3 to 5 years' time, those real innovators aren't too disadvantaged by this. I think possibly there could be a role for the Future Fund in that, possibly investing in pre-pandemic valuations or something like that. I don't have all the answers, but I would like to have seen government step into that space. The other failure I'm seeing, although there are a few, but the other main one I'd like to touch on is that our exporters, our future exporters, are going to need help. I've just got back from 4 years in the US, getting us set up over there. It's not easy. I couldn't have done it on a Zoom call. Just not possible at all. And of course, the rest of the world, which hasn't managed the pandemic as well as the Australian government has, they're still traveling. My friends in Europe are traveling, my friends in America are traveling, and Australians can't travel. And so we have a generation of businesses who in the next year or so would naturally be, in their natural expansion course, be going to the US, to Europe, to other places. They basically won't have that option. They're going to be set back a couple of years in their growth. And I think this feeds to something James was talking about earlier, when he talked about, I don't remember the phrase that he used, but procurement reforms. I'd kind of characterize it as using government as a marketplace. Government tries to do a lot themselves. And I think there's a real opportunity for government to recognize that it is the biggest client in Australia. Government, by opening themselves up as a marketplace, could actually help some of these companies bridge that gap to when they can go and export. And hopefully Austrade and others will be thinking about how they can help exporters as well. The other thing I just wanted to throw in is I think the next wave of absolute, first-time startups. There's a lot of people who are being made redundant at the moment who will have an idea. I think anything we can do to encourage them to be entrepreneurial and not just to go looking for another job would be really wise right now. I started my first business after I got made redundant from the government. Best thing that ever happened to me. And I think there's an opportunity there, but people need to be able to see some security. They need to be able to pay their mortgage while they do that. And I think a bit of help there would be a really good investment right now. And finally, I'd like to have seen a little bit of the infrastructure money, or a little bit more of the infrastructure money going towards local government. I think there's a lot of innovation in local government. I think you know, as the level of government closest to the people, getting communities to talk about how they want to pull out of this crisis, how they are best placed to invest that money, would be really, really strong thing to do right now. And I kind of feel there's a risk of a missed opportunity, although I'm hoping some of those buckets of money still have the flexibility that might happen.
Anyone wanted to sort of comment and jump in on any of the other comments from panelists? Just to go on, I think I heard sort of two broad themes. One is that it seems we have a window, I guess, we've got the oxygen mask, we've getting ourselves just, you know, some money to make sure that there isn't sort of massive destruction of our research institutions. But we're also in a global economy, and we've got lots of talk about sovereignty and capability and export markets, whilst we're also operating a little bit like an island, well, a lot like an island with the travel, but also things like the Foreign Investment Review Board that Matt Ed mentioned. So on one hand, we're kind of battening down the hatches to focus on what we're really good at. On the other hand, we're sort of keeping, you know, the rest of the world slightly at bay. Does anyone have any sort of comments on that dynamic? It has to be, and the word unprecedented is wildly overused, but it is an unusual dynamic right now.
Well, maybe I can comment on that. Yes, it is. And it does present us with real challenges. The primary challenge at the moment is to ensure that we can meet the demand for medical equipment, PPE, etc. As we discover that our supply chains have been hollowed out over many years, with the decline of manufacturing now down to 6% of GDP. And as has been said quite a lot, this is a big wake-up call for all of us that we can't survive as a post-industrial nation. Even if we're very good at services, we still need to grow our manufacturing. And manufacturing itself is not just a sector, it's a capability, and is linking and integrating much more closely now with the digital world, with the Internet of Things, and is including a lot of performance around artificial intelligence and machine learning, robotics. These are all critical to advanced nations. So yes, the companies that we do have in the manufacturing sector, many of them are very agile, and they proved that with the response to COVID, with ventilators and face masks and so on. But the issue is not simply to supply our own demand and with our own resources. It's also to be part of a globalized economy. Even though we're seeing protectionist forces across the world, we can't survive in that environment. We've got to be an open economy, and we've got to ensure that our SMEs, and that begins with our startups, are competitive from day one, that they're born global, and that we can participate like other small to medium-sized countries in global markets and value chains, and do that very effectively. And that means moving away, and we have already to some extent, from the large-scale vertically integrated manufacturing to smart specialization, which links services to manufacturing, and which is able to identify where the niches are. And those will depend on identifying also our own capabilities and how to capitalize on them. And it was mentioned earlier, local government is a very important level. Well, the local itself is a very important level, because it's at the local level that we can develop critical mass among our SMEs. Critical mass which can give rise to another generation of entrepreneurial startups that may be linked to universities or other research institutions, but certainly generate new R&D or are able to adapt international R&D effectively, so that we can develop new areas of value, of high value, that can make up for what we might see in the future in terms of diminishing returns in our resources exports. We know that Australia has dropped down the rankings right down to the bottom of the OECD in terms of our complexity, which measures our diversity and our research intensity of our exports. We really need to reverse that, and if this budget has made a start, then the next one and the one after that will have to continue that journey.
There's a couple of questions that I'm going to ask actually might ask it of you, Denham, because it's basically, what are the new government funding sources for startups? And it might be the case that there isn't any, but given that you've looked in great detail, that was a question from one of the viewers.
Yeah, sure. I think you're kind of right in that there isn't really anything new. I think the government would definitely argue the R&D tax incentive is there for startups, and that is kind of the biggest government support that's on offer for startups, but that obviously is kind of a tax offset, not extra funding, but that would be the big thing that startups would be looking at. But other than that, they could access the manufacturing fund, but you have to be in kind of the 6 key sectors that they've picked out. But other than that, no big new funding for startups at all in there.
Okay. Catherine.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I guess the people have been calling 2020 the Great Pause, except I've actually never been busier. I don't know if the rest of you are feeling this. This Great Pause seems to not have happened to me at all. And I've got 2 children under the age of 3 and a number of startups myself, as well as an academic role and some board directorship roles. And so I feel like we are actually still able to set a strategy for what we want to have going forwards. I feel like some of the funding that's been lacking may be coming because we need to make sure we have the frameworks around it. If we want to position ourselves as the deli counter of Asia, because we're never going to be the breadbasket, but we'll be the deli counter. If we want to position ourselves as a manufacturing capability in terms, especially some of the ARM hub work that's happening, both with Roy, but also up here in Queensland, we've got an ARM hub that's sitting here looking at advanced robotic manufacture and what that can possibly mean. And if I was to put my drones hat on, you know, I look at Melbourne being in the lockdown that it's been in for such a long time, and even the first 6 weeks of lockdown, if we'd already had remote traffic management organized around drone delivery to either take samples to hospitals or deliver me my morning coffee or something, I feel like there are things that we've kind of missed, that if we were to do the pandemic again, what would we do differently? And I feel like we should look again at some of those levers around how we could actually improve the lives of people that are in lockdown, how we could have improved the way samples got to hospitals. And in fact, we do need to do this because as soon as there's a vaccine to roll out, we need to innovate about how we get this vaccine out there. All the current vaccines that are in phase 3 trials need -80 degrees centigrade, and we need about 8,000 737s to get it around everywhere. We don't have that cold chain capability yet. So what can we do here in Australia as a lighthouse economy and as a global hub of excellence around drones, remotely piloted technology, autonomous technologies, and of course our wonderful UQ-based molecular clamp vaccine that's happening here in Queensland, which doesn't need -80, if I'm correct in that. How do we actually make sure that we can take the best of how we innovate, and how can we fund some of these opportunities without the red tape? So for me, it's great that there's not been, you know, a huge rush to suddenly just pump money in without strategy. But I do get concerned, and I think the cybersecurity strategy matches my concern in that we need sovereign capability. But in having sovereign capability, we create export capability. And what we need is 100 more Matts to come back from the US. I know Saul Griffith has just come back from the US and is currently in Sydney. And so some of these leaders in the fields of startups, entrepreneurship, robotics and innovation, how do we get them back to Australia, and what can we actually provide? I don't see any pure innovation funding really in this budget, which is lacking. I feel like in terms of our humanitarian work that we as a leader in the region is going to have to do, we are going to have to do this work with the vaccine in the next 2 years across all of our friends and neighbours. We're going to be manufacturing it here. So how do we help distribute that vaccine? I haven't seen anything really pump into that yet. So it's almost like the lessons that we've learned for the last 6 months, haven't quite seen that in sharp focus in this budget, but I'm wondering if there are parts of that money for a CSRO, money for the universities, which will be focused on the pandemic response. 2021 is not going to be the easy slip out of 2020 that we all think it's going to be, but it means that, as Shakespeare would say, it's where the rub lies. It's actually where the opportunity to actually turn some of our innovations that are trapped in universities or trapped in startups and actually get them out without red tape. How do we remove some of that regulatory red tape whilst keeping everything safe? And that conversation, I think, is another one for another day. But I would like to know Roy and Matt's opinions about that. Matt, who have your mates that have gone over that we can get back?
Can I jump on that and reframe that question? Because tell us about your mates and whether they'll come back. But also, you've sort of summarised this great thing that I think Australia can sometimes be criticised of not having, and that's a sense of speed and ambition. And everything we're talking about, whether it's, you know, the way that we sort of commercialise our intellectual property for global markets, whether we talk about emerging technologies and how we grab them to fit them to the opportunities that are fast arising in front of us. Matt, you've built a business, you know, there's a sense of ambition that is required to take something, an idea global. How does everything we're talking about a budget marry up against the kind of cultural shift that's required to really make this next 12, 24 and 5 years work for us?
Yeah, I sort of feel like a lot of the budget was about helping the sectors that are hurting, and it needed to be, and that was done. And so nothing I say asking for more for my sort of narrow sector should take away from that. But I think the next step is to address the opportunities, and Australia throws out innovative, energetic startups with great ideas and a lot of passion and ambition all the time. You know, I regularly come across other Australian entrepreneurs in the US. There are a lot of people out there making that same journey. And so I sort of feel like what's needed isn't a sort of blanket set of handouts, but it's help for people at certain stages of their journey so that they're more likely to succeed. I've never, you know, as a business, I mean, government is a large part of our client base, or nearly all of it, in fact, but we've never looked to government grants and schemes to, you know, to run or evolve our business. I kind of always viewed that as our job. But at the same time, you know, maybe that's partially because what's out there doesn't really fit what's, you know, the times when you need something. And a lot of that's about uncertainty. You know, I note that for the R&D grant, you know, there's a bit of uncertainty as to whether you qualify, to the point that there are whole consultancies dedicated to helping people to qualify. The same applies for the export subsidy grants, which, you know, you get money refunded as you spend it, and but you're never quite sure when you've qualified or how much will be in the pot till the end of the year. So it doesn't really help with your forward planning. And I think we can do better with those sorts of things. Particularly, as I said, at those two stages, the absolute start of startup, and then when people need to start exporting. It feels to me like those are the two big opportunities for us now. There are going to be a lot of people with good ideas prepared to take a risk, because the predominant barrier to them getting into entrepreneurial activities has been removed. And then there are a lot of businesses who are just about ready to export, who are now going to need a bit of extra help, or they're going to get outstripped overseas. And there's a scratch record on this Foreign Investment Review Board stuff, but basically what the government has, I'm sure unintentionally done, you know, they've tried to protect our business against predatory, low-cost buyouts from America, China, wherever. But what they've unintentionally done is given a leg up to the competitors of those companies overseas, who can access much larger investment markets. And I feel that that's something that needs to be looked at quite closely. Sorry, Corrie, I probably didn't answer your question. I just went off on a tangent.
That's all right. But the most important question is, do you have any friends and colleagues that might like to come to Australia? So I'll let you think on that, but that was a good question.
Corrie, sorry, just to interrupt again, but look, let me make it clear. All my friends and colleagues in America want to come to Australia right now.
Okay, good. Now, we're going to take some questions from the audience. So they're kind of fast and furious, because they're really sort of starting to load up. And I know we can't do everything, but we'll do our best. So first question, Sarah Pearson, thank you for joining us. How are you? There was a lot of talk about manufacturing, and to build on Roy's comment that we need to drive this strategically, the budget talks about providing dollars for innovation, but how do we make sure that companies use it effectively? And there was also funding set aside to look at commercialization of research. Does anyone know how this will be done? And Denham, I think you may have referred to this. Is this, that part is really about a proof of concept or scoping? Is that correct? So firstly, Denham, last question, and then back to Dr.
Yeah, I'll say my stuff and get out of the way for more interesting people. But yeah, it was part of the university funding. So it was $5.8 million for, they're calling it a scoping study, to look at different ways of helping the translation and commercialization of research. Not necessarily a translation fund, but that would be one of the obvious potential answers to come from it.
Mm.
Roy Green, how do companies use it effectively? Where's it going to really make a difference?
Well, just on this commercialization point first, I think we all recognise that Australia is very good at research. We're up there with the best universities in the world, but we don't necessarily translate that into commercial outcomes very successfully. Other people pick up our inventions and innovations and commercialise them elsewhere. So this study that Denham's just referred to is going to be a very important one. A lot of money is being allocated to it, about 5.8 million. So we'd expect to see some outcomes that might be included in this next budget or the one after. And that's going to be all part of this new architecture that we're hoping to see that would reimagine how we do investment, innovation and research in Australia. And in terms of how this is going to happen from now with the manufacturing initiative, what's it called? The Modern Manufacturing Initiative. The $1.3 billion component of that is quite intriguing. And Sarah's question is to the point because we don't know exactly how this is going to operate. It's been divided into 3 areas, one of which is around collaboration, which is going to be very large projects, collaborative projects between research institutions and business, and possibly some foreign direct investors as well, recognising that we need scale. We can specialise, but we also need scale in Australia. And the second element of that is the manufacturing translation funding. And so there will be some translation elements in this project funding as well. And finally, integration, which is how do we integrate manufacturers into global markets. We can't prescribe how manufacturers are going to invest and take advantage of these opportunities, but we can enable them. And that's the point that I think everyone is making, that we need the enablers there to get us to the markets that we know that we can penetrate.
Thank you. I can hear your puppy saying hello to everyone. So
yes, indeed, getting very anxious there.
Is it dinner time? Okay.
Probably hasn't read the best bits of the budget.
Yes, exactly. I have a question that someone has encouraged me to summarise, which I will do my best to do. This is from Mariel Chamberlain. And basically the question is, whilst we're talking about sovereign capability, we've sort of been a little bit distracted by some of the sexier stuff, if you like, and not focusing on the stuff where we could, probably doesn't make headlines, but very, export friendly and very useful. And some of the examples, bio-based ag feedstocks, carbon neutral processing, amazing body of R&D capability already here, and a natural advantage in these categories. We could export feedstocks to Asia too. We have to buy this stuff as taxpayers. Why not lead? Are we thinking a little bit too narrowly when we talk about sovereignty? Anyone?
I think yes. Oh my gosh, there are so many amazing startups, so many amazing female-run startups. Mariel's awesome. She runs a brilliant startup around manufacturing and looking at things from an ethical point of view. And I guess it's this idea of be the change that you want to see and work in a way that you want to work. When you look at the climate crisis that we're all facing, and my children will be living, what is it that we want and how do we lead it? And we have to put money into lead stuff before it becomes business as usual. So the idea of carbon negativity rather than carbon neutrality is one of the key things we should look at in our business models. As a board director, as part of my fiduciary duties, do we want to look at some of the environmental impacts and the environmental opportunities that we have when we manufacture, or how we operate, and how we can start having conversations around carbon negative rather than carbon neutral. We have a need to be completely sovereign on so many different parts of our supply chains. Examples are from, the face masks that we need for a pandemic response, but also from personal hygiene and from female sanitary products and things like that. If they're not necessarily made in Australia, and why not? We grow cotton here. Why can't we have organic cotton products? This is a resource that we're exporting. So how do we keep some of our strengths and actually look at how we turn those into the secondary and tertiary value products of those primary products that we're producing? Ag tech is You know, Australia is known for its ag tech. We're so good with smart farms. We're so good with ag tech. We've got everything from robots that can identify weeds and spray them with herbicide, and drones that can fly around fields and pick off weeds and things, you know, in ways that, you know, will change the face of how we actually work our agricultural land. But another thing that was slightly missing from the budget for me was this idea of biodiversity support. We'll probably need about $1 billion to rewild Australia to the area of biodiversity that it should have been. I'd have liked to have seen something there in terms of our Indigenous rangers, our Indigenous sea and land rangers, and how they could actually be supported to actually use new technologies, but also how we can actually listen to people to learn about how we best use these technologies. I'm hoping that some of the academic funding will match some of that need. But we have so many opportunities to lead. But price point is normally the thing that people go with first. And so this is about quality, not quantity. So it may be that there are some things that it's never financially viable to make in Australia unless we subsidise it. Well, subsidies are not something that's foreign to this federal government or federal governments beforehand. So maybe we need to think local, act global, and actually support some of those businesses that are leading based on our ethical frameworks and our capabilities as a nation to actually instill change globally. Or am I just being an optimist?
Oh, I think optimism is a very sorely needed ingredient right now. There is a question about, you know, lack of diversity. I will read it specifically. I remain puzzled why as a country we still struggle with diversity. The government remains suspicious of purchasing from small, growing businesses and remarkably will not elevate the CSIRO in its thinking, strategic priorities and financial support. I think we stopped using the term clever country some time ago. Response to that? I think when it comes to the procurement thing, I think, James, you're well on record to say this is one incredibly important lever that we don't pull very well. Anyone else have a response? I guess that's more of a statement, but. Sorry, Roy, you're on mute.
Sorry, it's a very true statement, and it's one of the big drawbacks of the period since tariffs were reduced and when we decided to participate in a global economy. Prior to that, we were a very diverse economy. Our manufacturing was around 30% and agriculture close to that. It was, and services have obviously grown since then. But during the mining boom in particular, we became very focused on increasing our national income, and we did very successfully, around 15% over a 6-year period, simply because of the terms of trade going up. But with a high dollar, of course, a lot of the companies that had really succeeded since tariffs to become, participating in those global markets and value chains were made uncompetitive by the high dollar. And ever since then, we've seen less and less diversity in our economy, not more. And that's despite the fact that many of the companies that remain from that period are incredibly effective and the global leaders sometimes in their value chains and in their consumer markets. We probably have around 1,500 companies like that in Australia that are the best in their class. It's just that we don't have enough of them. We need to have a Mittelstand like Germany. We need to develop the centers of excellence like the Fraunhofer Institutes in Germany, which have been emulated also in the UK with the catapult centers, the high value manufacturing catapults and the manufacturing institutes in the US. And given that the government has announced that their manufacturing initiative is a 10-year plan, although only the first 4 years are funded at the moment, it does give us some hope that over a 10-year period that we'll see some attempt to diversify our economy, and using public procurement particularly. One of the US programs that's been extremely successful over the post-war period was the so-called SBIR, the Small Business Innovation and Research Program, and that mandated government departments to spend a certain percentage of their funding on novel and emerging SMEs to use their technologies and then to grow them. And some of those very small companies have grown very large indeed. And that's the power of government. It can't create those companies, but it can enable them to become successful.
I think there's a running joke in our office about the complex economy of a cow. It would make a good album cover. No, but I think the idea of developing a more complex economy is still something that's not fully understood, but is a really nice way of, I guess, bringing together all those different elements that need to work in unison to lift capability. Matt Crozier, I just wanted to bring you in here.
Thanks. Yeah, I could see somewhere out there Dick Smith getting very excited at this conversation and revamping his Vegemite brand or whatever it might have been. And I just want to throw in a note of caution. I totally agree, particularly with the stuff Catherine was saying, that where we have a market failure, government should be getting involved. And there are industries, particularly around climate change, that absolutely, as a country, we should be using our smarts to get in there. We should be helping those companies to get established before they go to a global stage. But some of this conversation is kind of leaning itself towards protectionism. And that really worries me. I mean, we've got Joe Biden, running for the presidency and saying that the Buy America scheme is coming in. Some of the schemes that are in America look very successful. There are, schemes to encourage minority-owned businesses, for instance, by mandating purchasing. But when you're actually in America working in government, there are actually a plethora of companies that you buy through to get to them. So it hasn't, I mean, I'm sure there are some companies that it's driven innovation, but some of the unintended consequences have been just adding to the transaction costs, adding to the costs for government. And I think government needs to be a bit careful at where it soldiers into this. I think it needs to encourage and pull the levers subtly, but let's not let go of the idea of a free global market, because this country benefits magnificently from that and stands to continue to do so. And I'm worried that if we fall back to the sort of comfortable notion of protectionism and buy Australian and things like that, we just encourage everybody else to do it. And ultimately it'll be our companies that lose because of that.
We're getting towards the end. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got 6 months till the next federal budget in May, presuming things return to normal. Just as a quick whip around, what will be the most important thing that will be done in this 6 months leading up to the next budget from a federal government perspective? Roy Green?
Well, I think the most important element I'll be looking for is a joined up strategy. We've got a lot of measures that have been announced in this budget, and some of them are very good, and some of them have been very well thought out by their departments. But we don't have a joined up industrial strategy like other countries. We found before, when doing one of our reviews, that we have our research and innovation expenditure spread across 13 different portfolios of government and 150 different budget line items, very few of which connect with each other. And this is not efficient. It can't provide for visionary policy. It provides for silos between departments, and it creates immense confusion among companies and those who are endeavouring to follow government priorities, especially if we're to focus on the 6 sectors or technologies that have been announced in the manufacturing strategy. These are technologies that are important to us, and Australia can't do everything, of course. As Matt said, we're part of a globalised economy. We only do 2% of the world's R&D. We're not going to do everything. We can't be excellent at everything. We do need to pick and choose. And if the government at the next budget starts to use the term mission-led research and innovation, I think a lot of us will start feeling more comfortable that we've got the message across.
It's time for focus, coordination and ambition all at the same time. Catherine Ball.
I think I'd like to see a couple of pieces of policy come out, not just fiscal, but also immigration. I feel like we have an opportunity, especially with the announcement for the support of Hong Kong businesses to establish in Australia. We've got an opportunity to create the new Hong Kong here in the Asia Pacific region if we really want it. We also have an opportunity to attract some of these amazingly successful individuals in from across the world, not just Silicon Valley, but other areas, to shore up and also seed some of our innovation ecosystem here with their ideas, but also to support our homegrown startups and prevent them from leaving. We are one of the best places, I'd say the best place in the world to start a business. So if you want to start a business, you can do it with $500 in the bank and a glint in your eye and off you go. It's a wonderful place to start. start businesses, and I do it frequently. My husband has restricted how many businesses I start now. So it's somewhere that I think is very attractive to foreign individuals who may want to come in, or Australians who might want to return home. So I'd like to see maybe some money around actually helping some of those businesses establish here. I'd like to see some ways in which we can actually openly encourage our universities to work with non-sovereign entities to make them sovereign entities and bring their expertise into Australia. And I think this is the key, is that diversity is power, and that means not shutting the doors to the idea that we will need immigrants, and that we're going to have a population crisis if we don't actually shore up some of our skilled migration and people that can bring value to Australia and the needs that we're going to have in the next 5-10 years off the back of the pandemic.
Thank you. And Matt Crozier.
Yeah, I'd like to add and me to what Catherine said about diversity and immigration. I think it's really critical, adds so much value to this country. And I think, yeah, so many, well, I think most of us on this call are probably immigrants, and there's so much out there that we as a country gain from that. And I think the other thing the government needs to do, it sounds a bit cheesy, but is keep us safe and get us open. Like the one thing, we can all sit and pick at different aspects, but the one thing I really appreciate is that, we are broadly speaking open here, and or at least getting very close, with my apologies to Denham, who's probably still locked in that room, but we're getting there. And I think that there's enormous value in that for all of our businesses. So I think that really should be acknowledged and should be one of the priorities.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank our panelists, Professor Roy Green, lovely to talk with you as it always is.
Yep.
Dr. Catherine Ball, thank you so much. It's been really nice to have you as part of the discussion. Matt Crozier, thank you. Welcome home.
Thanks.
And Denham and James, for all of that work that you do, sort of bringing to life some of the, the details so the rest of us don't have to. Thank you so much, and thank you for adding your voices to today's discussion. So next year, presuming all is back to normal, we should probably do a budget roadshow. I don't know how we do that in multiple cities, just to make up for the fact we didn't get to enjoy our typical soiree with a glass of wine. But we made do, and we had a good discussion, I think, and it was made possible by all of you. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you all in person soon. Thank you. Oh, actually, call to action, newsletter. Subscribe. I sound like my 6-year-old now saying subscribe to YouTube. But anyway, you'll find if you want to share any of the stories that that came from the budget today, but also a summary that James will be writing of tonight's discussion, please do so. So thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.